So without further ado, let me introduce to you Professor Michael Marrus, who is from the University of Toronto, the History Department. He got his bachelor's with honors at the University of Toronto, and then did both his master's and his PhD degree at the University of California in Berkeley. He has been at the University of Toronto since 1963 and was appointed professor of history there in 1978. He has also been a senior associate member at St. Anthony's College in Oxford from 1978 to 1980, and also a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in 1985-86. He has a very impressive list of fellowships, awards, and prizes, and I am not going to begin to try to read you the entire list, but I have selected out a few that I thought were particularly noteworthy. He has received a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship in 1963, and then a dissertation fellowship from the same organization 3 years later. He has 4 fellowships from the Canada Council in 1964, 69, 72, and 73. He was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1984, and a grant from the Ontario Arts Council for the Holocaust in History in 1987. In 1987, he also was made a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Many of his most important writings have received very prestigious awards. He was awarded the National Book Award for Vichy France and the Jews in 1982, the Present Tense Literary Award for The Unwanted in 1985, the Wallace K. Ferguson Prize for the Holocaust in History in 1988, and the next year, for the same work, the Joseph Tannenbaum Prize. Among his publications, I'm not going to read you a lot of the titles, but mainly the topics. He has published extensively in several areas, particularly notably about the notorious Dreyfus Affair in late 19th century France, the Jewish response to it, the French response to it, and assimilation among Jews in 19th century France. All of those are separate topics on which he has published a number of items. He has written on the history of Vichy France, the historical background that made Vichy France possible, Vichy France and the Jews, and about French anti-Semitism. He's done much writing about the Holocaust, refugees, Zionism, Jewish responses to anti-Semitism. Lest you think that Professor Marrus writes only about the darker side of human history, let me assure you that his publications include several articles about the rise of leisure in industrial society. In the Journal of Social History, there's an article on the uses of folklore, and another one on social drinking in the Belle Epoque. In 1991, Penguin Books published Mr. Sam, The Life and Times of Samuel Bronfman. Samuel Bronfman, whose last name means whiskey man, is actually the founder of Seagram's Whiskey. And finally, he is published in the Dance Research Journal with an article titled Modernization and Dancing in Rural France, from La Bourrée to Le Foxtrot. Please welcome Dr. Michael Marrus.
Thank you very much for that very fulsome, too fulsome introduction, which leaves me almost too embarrassed to continue. Ladies and gentlemen, for those of us who are preoccupied with the sober issue that brings us here this evening, the history of the Holocaust, and also, I might add, the wider history of the Second World War, this is very much a time of anniversaries, and therefore a time to recollect collectively on the significance of these events in our own time. The anniversaries of the Holocaust began, I think erroneously, in 1988 with the 50th anniversary of Kristallnacht and I well remember the title of the article in the New York Times Magazine, Kristallnacht, the beginning of the Holocaust. I think they got it wrong, but I think the substance of the article was actually quite well done. But in any event, this is the 50th anniversary, and we face a series of 50th anniversaries. In last year, we had the anniversary of the Wannsee Conference, the organizational meeting of Nazi bureaucrats to plan the implementation of the final solution on a European-wide scale. A very important commemoration, important for historians, certainly, and a landmark in this history. I happened to have been at a conference in Poland just a few weeks ago, and at a hotel in Warsaw, I heard some people speaking Hebrew at the table next to me in a restaurant in the hotel. I found there a colleague who I knew from his work on the Holocaust. What was he doing there in Warsaw? He was there with an Israeli team. They were renting facilities for next year's 50th anniversary, next April, of the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto. And so we have a series of these commemorations. And this event, to some degree, here at Oregon State University is part of them. Now let me suggest that there is something going on with all of these events, and it is my theme this evening, and I would like to discuss it with you and then get your own reactions, questions, impressions on it. I believe that this 50th anniversary is more than a half-century milestone. It marks indeed the passage of this event, the Nazi Holocaust, from the lived experience of people, many of whom happily are still with us, people who suffered and experienced persecution directly themselves. It marks the passage from lived experience and from persons old enough to have gone through these events, though not having been directly involved in them, the passage from that lived experience to history like other histories, histories of events that are in the past. That is the process. It is the transition, the passage from one to the other. And I think we're going through that now, and I invite you to consider, as you watch these commemorative events, be they in ceremonies, be they in various presentation on the news media or whatever, watch and consider these events, wherever they may be and however you encounter them, and see if you don't see yourselves evidence of this passage, of this transition. I suggest that you will see, as you track these events, evidence of what I'm speaking about. Those who are the survivors, and those for whom this is not history, but part of their own personal life experience, those persons now necessarily are not the decision makers. Of course, the great decision makers were gone long ago. Hitler, Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, and the tier beneath them, those who made the important decisions at that time. De Gaulle. But Jews too made some decisions. There were Jewish leaders in the West. There were some Jewish leaders in occupied Europe. These were invariably men, and men of middle age. And so they are no longer with us. But there are people who were younger then and whose experience is very much one of personal involvement, but experience, not accounting for their decisions. They cannot ruminate on decisions taken of a strategic sort. Even the perpetrators, the few who remain, were not the big fish, did not make the major decisions. The last of note, Klaus Barbie, was an SS major in the city of Lyon. So the Eichmanns, the Wislicenys, more important SS figures, again, long gone. And so, when those for whom this is lived experience speak, they speak about their recollections and their suffering and their privation, on the one hand, and they do speak, and they should speak. But then there are the historians, and they also speak, and they speak with quite a different voice. They speak with the voice of history as it is spoken in our culture, a voice which involves comparisons, which involves qualifications, which involves ideas, theories back and forth, theories that are contested, that are reviewed, that are qualified, that are examined, and that form part of the academic establishment of which I am certainly a part. And this is the environment in which I am speaking this evening. This is to suggest, let me be explicit, that it is not an easy passage. It's not easy, certainly, for those for whom this has been lived history. I had a direct experience of this myself about a month ago in one of my less successful speaking engagements when I was speaking in Washington, D.C. at a conference sponsored by the United States Holocaust Memorial Council. And I was asked to give a talk on the historiography of the Holocaust, that is, current interpretations, to a conference that brought together teachers, high school teachers for the most part, and survivors of the Holocaust. The teachers were very eager to hear about the recent historical literature, the recent trends, patterns of research. As for the survivors, many of them were interested too, but I have to admit, and I have some empathy for them, many felt this passage as a kind of violation. And I think it's well to be explicit and clear about this. It isn't easy to find an event that you have lived through discussed as history, discussed by a young man or young woman, often born after the event, and talking about it as though it were like the French Revolution, or the Civil War, or the First World War. That is to say, an event, as I've described it, about which there are ideas back and forth, about which people debate, theses, dissertations, different points of view, rival hypotheses, and so forth. That isn't always an easy thing to experience. I think, quite frankly, those who have survived often feel that it is, in a sense, a violation, that it is their job to speak the unspeakable and to relay an event that can never fully be comprehended and relayed, but that it is their job, their task, their mission, their goal to communicate. The sense, as Yehuda Bauer, the Israeli historian, once put it, that their suffering will be drowned in oceans of footnotes. The sense, you see, is that their suffering will somehow be diminished as it is the object of academic discourse. That as qualifications are introduced, as comparisons are introduced, the very uniqueness of their experience will be lost from sight, and that mistakes will be made. Mistakes inevitably are made by those who come after, and for whom this is history learned from books and from documents, and occasionally from tapes, but not through suffering in the flesh and things seen with their own eyes. That process, however, is inevitable, and what I want to do this evening is to discuss some of the issues associated with it, and then to consider collectively your response and your reactions to it. Very much, it seems to me, we are in this process now. And I think that the process, the passage from lived experience to history, is marked as well by the current of literature that I read as a historian of the Holocaust, and most importantly, and I take some optimism from this, by the integration of this history into the historical record of our time. You know, when one goes back to the post-war period, or for that matter to the 1950s and even the 1960s, one does not find the Holocaust in the history books. Choose a textbook on Western civilization, such as I studied at Berkeley in the mid-1960s. Take R.R. Palmer's History of the Modern World, or any of the contending textbooks that were on offer at the time. One will find perhaps a line or two, a page at the very most, about the history of the Holocaust. And so it goes with histories of the Second World War, often nothing at all. Histories of Germany, again, one written by a colleague in my own department, a man named Ralph Flenley, and I looked it up a few years ago, again, silent on this subject. It was not part of history. By the way, I don't attribute this necessarily to anti-Jewish animus, though some of that may have been there. For the truth of the matter is that Jews too were silent in the post-war period. Jews too were silent for a variety of complex reasons that are often worth exploring. There were significant memoirs. There were significant memoirs that one can point to. But these circulated within a largely Jewish milieu. They were not part of the common culture, not exposed on the media, certainly not integrated into the historical literature, let alone the historical consciousness. All of that is a product of the late 1960s and subsequently. And now I think, again, this is to anticipate, and this is the burden of my remarks, that integration is now there. Look at the same textbooks. Look at those histories of Germany. Look at the media. One can say that the Holocaust is not well treated, and Elie Wiesel laments, and I think often laments rightly, about the trivialization, the popularization, the distortion involved in media exposure. But it is an entirely different order of problem, for the silence, at least, is gone. Now, what I want to do by way of illustration is to relay, in a very short period of time, what I think has been the result of this very considerable historical discourse. In a word, I think that historical consideration of the Holocaust, the process, again, if you like, of the normalization of the Holocaust, has involved a change in intellectual perspective. A change from the perspectives that were first available in the post-war period and which dominated the thinking that did exist on the subject through to the 1970s. I believe that thinkers who did address the subject, and there were several, and some important figures as well, did not consider the Holocaust, again, as a part of normal history. They considered it a separate problem, a problem apart, a problem largely concerning Jews, but not, as we'll see, exclusively so. They tried to grasp the whole. They tried to grasp the Holocaust, as many of us still do, as a critical problem of morality and civilization. I think that there were three broad strands of thinking about the Holocaust until this transformation that I'm describing was underway. Three broad strands. Let me consider them now, and then let me indicate to you how I think they have evolved and been transformed. The first of these has to do with anti-Semitism. From the beginning, probably the most important school of thought within Jewish circles considered the Holocaust as the product of the anti-Semitism of Christendom. Establishing the history of anti-Semitism and establishing its murderous potential was the principal object of the work of such historians as Leon Poliakov and a variety of others who wrote about anti-Semitism in the post-war decades. Their concern was not only to show the deep entrenchment of anti-Semitism within the Western and Christian tradition, but also to show its importance in modern Germany, going back to the anti-Semitic ravings of Martin Luther, and also as well to show that in other European countries there were anti-Semitic traditions, to relay the history of the secularization of this anti-Semitic tradition in the 19th century, to show how towards the end of the century this anti-Semitic tradition merged with doctrines of scientific racism, to show how the Jews were frequently the target not only of racist thought but of social Darwinism, and how all of this was part of this broad current that Poliakov traced back to classical antiquity and before, focusing on the anti-Semitic roots and trying to find within various texts a pointing towards the mass murder of the mid-20th century. Focusing then on anti-Semitism and writing around the subject of the Holocaust from this vantage point. This is the first and probably the most important current of writing and thinking. A second has to do with totalitarianism, and I would identify this foremost with the German Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt, in her very important book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which was first published in 1952. I think Arendt's work on the Nazi Holocaust is invariably associated with her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. Let me say, that latter book came out of Hannah Arendt's reportage on the Eichmann trial. It came a decade later. The book was published in 1962. These were articles first written for New Yorker magazine and involved other hypotheses which were far less securely grounded in not only research but Arendt's own thinking. As such, Eichmann in Jerusalem is a much slighter work, a much less important document. But the origins of totalitarianism is important. Arendt was one of the first to see a comparability between Soviet and Nazi repressive systems, between the kind of regime established by Hitler and that established by Stalin. And in this work, which is a very dense and complex work, Arendt considered that modern society was pointing in the direction of ever-increasing control by units of government over ordinary people. People who once formed part of communities that were closely integrated, communities of home, of religious belief, of locality, were increasingly broken up by the processes of industrialization, mass migration, war. Government apparatuses tried to control an increasingly mass society, and as they did so, they developed instruments of control which, as they developed, pointed towards totalitarianism. And what was the laboratory of totalitarianism? The cutting edge, the most developed focal point of totalitarian domination? The concentration camp. To Arendt, the Nazi Holocaust saw the Jews victimized as the first group to be singled out by a machinery that was eventually to apply to wider segments of the population. What happened to the Jews? The Jews were turned into things. Things that could be used and then discarded and then destroyed. And Arendt developed a whole vision, and a chilling vision it is, in The Origins of Totalitarianism. Again, one of the first to meditate upon the significance of the concentration and the death camps in a passionate way, and in some respects a way that has not been superseded. I would say that in an important sense, the path-breaking work by Raoul Hilberg fits within this wider tradition. Raoul Hilberg, who's, again, path-breaking, and I think by far still the most important book that has ever been written on the Holocaust, uses as its central image the machine. It is a pan-European machine that grinds on everywhere, destroying the people who are victimized by it, of course, in this case, the Jews. Once again, the implication is that this machinery could be turned upon others as well. So, totalitarianism, the second. And the third, modernization. Many writers were struck, indeed were struck from the beginning, as the Holocaust was contemplated, by the fact that the people who carried out this destruction of European Jewry, the people in whose name the persecution of the Jews was launched across Europe, was the most developed, the most scientifically advanced, the most technologically sophisticated of European peoples, or so it was said. And so a number of writers, beginning with some important German scholars, I think of the liberal historian Friedrich Meinecke, who in 1946 considered that German society, having undergone a very rapid process of modernization, was precipitated into an environment of mass democracy, making it susceptible to manipulation by a demagogic dictator. And others, Richard Rubinstein, identifying the Holocaust as the culmination of certain trends in modern society, and a number of others. The most recent exemplar of this trend is the British sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, who's recently written a book called Modernity and the Holocaust. These are, to summarize, these are grand visions. And I think much of the writing in this period, I'm talking about the period up to the 1970s, was under the influence of these grand visions. Now, the theme that I am conveying and what I'm trying to communicate is that there has been a significant evolution. There is an entry, an inevitable passage of the Holocaust into the arena of normal history, by which I mean that this theme is now brought within the frame of reference, the rules of research and writing that apply to other themes such as I've mentioned, and this is what I want to consider now. Let me look at each one of these larger visions and see what has happened to them. Take anti-Semitism first of all. The critical observations of a number of historians began with the consideration that, when it came to anti-Semitism, Germany was by no means the most anti-Semitic country in Europe. One can certainly find a much more intense anti-Jewish mobilization in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Hungary, in Romania. And further, detailed and critical examinations of Western countries, France, which I worked on. George Mossy, the beloved historian of Germany at the University of Wisconsin, often said that if you were asked in 1890, if you were told in 1890 that one European country would visit a great calamity upon the Jewish people of Europe, and you were asked which would that country be on the evidence available in the 1890s, which country would you select? Well, most people would select Tsarist Russia. But let's say you were said, all right, but it can't be Tsarist Russia. What country is it? The obvious answer would be France. France had a far more publicly expressed anti-Semitic mobilization. That's the 1890s. Come to the 1920s or 1930s. It was far easier for a Jew to become a professor at a German university in the 1920s than it was for a Jew to become professor in Canada. As a matter of fact, a Jew couldn't become a professor in Canada. In the United States, it wasn't significantly better. We now have public opinion surveys coming from North America that show a quite significant level of anti-Semitism. So, if anti-Semitism is at the root of it, why Germany? How does one account for the difference between Germany and Great Britain? This is just the beginning of the problem. We have concrete studies now of public opinion under Nazism. Is anti-Semitism the driving force behind the persecution of the Jews in Germany? It's difficult to make a case. Now that we draw upon these concrete studies, one does not find significant evidence of pressures from the German population against the Jews. Even during Kristallnacht, which I mentioned. In fact, again, the very detailed and quite sophisticated by now studies of German public opinion frequently show a German public actually rather unsettled by the riots of Kristallnacht. All of that broken glass, all of that property destroyed, all of that uncontrolled and undisciplined violence. Move from public opinion. Look at the Nazi bureaucracy, as my friend Christopher Browning has done, looking at the anti-Jewish desk of the German Foreign Office. Moving from the generalizations, Browning decided to look at a specific agency of the Nazi government, and quite an important agency it was, coordinating anti-Jewish policy across Europe. This is not an agency made up of anti-Jewish zealots. As a matter of fact, in Browning's observation at least, what moves most of these people is careerism. What moves most of them is conformity, a desire to get on with their careers. There are some anti-Semites. There are others who are largely indifferent. And by the way, indifference looms far larger in the findings of historians than does anti-Semitism. This is something that Bob Paxton and I certainly found when it came to France. So, you have anti-Jewish policy. You have a Nazi minority animated and obsessed with the Jews. but you don't have an entire culture programmed, as some at least of the hypotheses seem to have suggested. You don't have an entire society programmed and mobilized, as some of those hypotheses suggested. And historians find their way and make their conclusions on the basis of those findings. We'll return to this. I hope at least we will in our discussion and question. Totalitarianism. Those of you who have spent some time with the history of the Third Reich know that the fortunes of this totalitarian model have not been very good. A small army of historians have turned their task, have turned their efforts to the task of looking at the Nazi apparatus itself. Is it machine-like? Is it efficient? Is it well organized and disciplined and schooled and compartmentalized, as Hannah Arendt seemed to suggest in her model? It is not. It turns out to be a sea of competing agencies involved in intense rivalry one with the other, hardly coordinated and disciplined and schooled the way the totalitarian model would have had it. Moreover, what we have found since the original models were proposed is that a great deal depends upon the specific environment within which the Nazis operated. The Nazis had remarkable success in Poland, where some 90% of the Jews, of the 3.25 million Jews who lived there before the war, were murdered. The Nazis also had remarkable success in the Netherlands. By the way, two very different countries as far as their anti-Jewish climate is concerned. Poland, very intense anti-Jewish climate. The Netherlands, to the contrary. And then what about Italy? An ally of the Reich, a fascist country, where the Italians, not only within Italy, but outside Italy, protected Jews. By the way, this reflects upon the first notion about anti-Semitism. If anti-Semitism is deeply embedded and is an integral part of the Christian tradition, ought this not to apply in Italy, an intensely Catholic country, at least as Catholic as Poland? And yet look how different these countries are. Where then is the schooled and disciplined and uniform and machine-like totalitarian apparatus? By the way, it's worth lingering a bit longer over Italy. We have now a number of studies. Recently, the Cambridge historian Jonathan Steinberg has written a book, again trying to come to grips with the Italian exception. We knew a great deal about the Danish exception. By the way, yet another exception for the same Lutheranism to which could be attributed the heritage of Luther's anti-Semitism seems in Denmark to have militated significantly in the opposite direction, where the Danish population seems to have been mobilized to rescue the tiny Jewish community. On the other hand, anyone with eyes to see a map realizes that the circumstances of Denmark were very special. There is a small body of water that you can practically swim across, and a neutral country, Sweden, willing to accept the Jews. So geography enters into the scheme of things. Geography and also chronology. For as the historians who have moved away from these large models and have tried to do their more specific and concrete and monographic research reminded us, Denmark was a model protectorate. The Nazis called it the model protectorate. Denmark was not a society mobilized against Nazism from the beginning. To the contrary, The Danes are ill-considered by many of the Scandinavian peoples to this day because they surrendered in 1940 practically without firing a shot. And for practically 3 years, virtually 3 years, the Danes lived in a harmonious and economically cooperative relationship with the Third Reich. Then, in the summer of 1943, the Germans cracked down hard, and it was then that they decided to deport the Jews of Denmark. So chronology enters into the explanatory mix as far as the fate of the Jews of Denmark is concerned. To return to Italy, you see how I'm starting to digress all over the place, and this is, again, one illustration of the way this historiography has exploded and has broadened and has contributed, I think, significantly to an undermining of some of these grand and general theories, or at least their qualification. Once again, to come back, try to hold myself to it, to Nazi totalitarianism. Yes, Hannah Arendt writes passionately and with a great deal of insight and truth about the Nazi concentration camps. But 1/3 of the Jews who were murdered in Europe never saw a concentration camp. They were starved to death in ghettos, or shot by the Einsatzgruppen in Eastern Europe, or murdered in any countless circumstances that had, before they ever were deported to concentration camps or the death camps. So Arendt's model tells us something about the reality of those camps. I think she captures truth about that experience. As far as explaining the whole, it cannot stand. And so it is finally with modernization. For the more historians have examined Nazism, the more questions have been raised about how to apply the modernization model to Nazism itself. Modernization, which itself is under significant assault from social scientists, of whom I expect that there are some here, and they know what I'm talking about. What do we mean when we say there is something called modernization? Does this mean the path that we have taken to the present? But is this the path that every society takes? Is Nazism, quote, modern, unquote, at all? Or is Nazism a reversion to a pre-modern, a pagan environment? Does Nazism represent a revolt against modernity? Such is also a hypothesis. An intellectual historian recently has tried to reconcile contrary points of view, Jeffrey Herf, saying that Nazism is reactionary modernism. And needless to say, in his explanatory model, there is reason enough for the reactionary modernists to hate the Jews. Is the Nazis' process of murdering the Jews of Europe a, quote, modern undertaking? It's true that there are some modern processes used. But when one studies closely the mechanisms used for mass murder, it's hard to be persuaded that this is scientific ingenuity applied to this problem. Hitler had a perception about the most advanced schools of technology in Germany, that they represented a kind of Jewish science. Hitler himself was rather suspicious of much of scientific research, and his own preferences, his own personal preferences, were far indeed from what we would comfortably think of as modern. Look at Mein Kampf, for example. See the model that Hitler proposes for the German who will dominate Europe. Who is the German who will dominate Europe? He will be of pure Aryan blood, and he will establish a kind of homestead on the steppes of territory conquered from Soviet Russia, and at the end of a hard day's work, he will lean upon his plow. Hitler has this image in Mein Kampf, and he will look to the blacksmith, and one imagines, though Hitler doesn't say so, and he will live in a thatched hut. This was Hitler's own model, when at the very same moment, the Soviets had a model of the peasant in a collective farm astride a tractor, at the very limit of scientific advance and so forth. This wasn't Hitler's idea at all. Anyway, look, we'll come back to this general critique as well. My sense is, you see it now, that the critics are doing their job. As the critics are doing their job in virtually every historical field I know. I want to underscore that not everyone feels comfortable in this critical environment. There is a sense of loss, I think, experienced by those who with every justification look for a key, for an explanation that can be universally agreed to. What caused the Holocaust? And could it happen again? But you know, how would people feel if this question is posed again about the French Revolution? What caused the French Revolution? If this were a lecture by a leading historian of the French Revolution, which I'm certainly not, I can imagine him saying, oh, but you know, this isn't what we do. We contend with the evidence, we develop our theories, we take our pieces of the French Revolution, we try to contend with it, we advance our knowledge step by step. This is, I think, happening with the Holocaust. I believe we do get, we have now a deeper understanding by virtue of all of this monographic effort. We have a sense of what the Holocaust was like in France. We have a sense of its chronology. We have a sense of the Nazi bureaucracy and how it worked. We have a sense of who was involved and why they were involved. Again, my friend Christopher Browning has taken one particular unit of Ordnungspolizei. These are military policemen mobilized in the port city of Hamburg. They were sent to Eastern Europe as occupation troops, police officers, essentially, to keep order behind the lines in the process of the Nazis' conquest of the Soviet Union. And as part of their work, they became involved in murder, horrific murders, murdering thousands of people. They actually, Browning found, had an option. At a certain point, the commanding officer said those who cannot do this may be excused. And some did, but most didn't. Most, in fact, did the work. Who were these people, and what made them do it? We now have Browning's answer in a book significantly entitled Ordinary Men. These were older men, too old to have been mobilized as regular Wehrmacht troops. They did not have a Nazi education as a result. They had been educated in the 1920s. They were largely working class, coming therefore from one of the least Nazified social groups in Germany, from actually a city that was one of the least Nazified of German cities. And yet they did it. So we have at least for this unit, but we must take care in generalizing, and Browning is one of the first to say we must take care of why they at least did what they did. So we have these various elements. We have these partial and incomplete assessments. Together, they advance our knowledge. I think they do something else, and I'll close with this. I think they integrate the history of the Holocaust into the history of our time. They don't answer all the questions, and these are questions that are inevitably, or should at least, preoccupying each and every one of us. But history doesn't do that. History doesn't tell us in any easy formula why revolutions break out, or why wars happen, or how wars end. History does, I think, deepen our understanding, and history does finally establish the record of what people think was of fundamental and deep significance. And now I think, 50 years after the Holocaust, that may be said, quite properly is said, about the Holocaust itself. The Holocaust has become part of the history of our time. Thank you very much.
What should be of particular concern to academics is the book burning that took place already in May of 1933, within really 60 or 90 days of the takeover of power by the Nazis, and an event which in fact surprised the Nazi leadership by its ferocity and by the quickness with which it came to pass on university campuses all across Germany.
This indeed happened, and it is something well to ponder, particularly because I have to say I think the impulse to burn books in some way is widespread. One doesn't have to be a Nazi to feel this impulse. And I'm not just talking. Well, I'm not talking about any particular body of opinion in particular at all. But to move from a sense of outrage to a sense of banning is deep, deep in our culture. Now, as to the specific episode that you mentioned, so far as I know, there is no evidence whatsoever that the German people as a whole wanted to burn books. There was a Nazi party that had a significant, intensely and activist anti-Jewish element. I would stress the activism. Much of the historiography looking at specific events such as the riots of Kristallnacht, such as the Nuremberg laws, considers that it is within the Nazi party a significant objective to accord to that activist element certain opportunities. And so we're talking about the SA, and we're talking about Nazi activists for the most part. I don't think there is any evidence, though, that Germans everywhere across the country wanted to burn books. Let me only add this, however, that, and it is again worth pondering, the degree to which the German student body became Nazified is quite extraordinary. And
well, for that matter, the professor as well, which I find really troubling, that they so quickly embrace this ideology with these ceremonies under no pressure whatsoever.
There is much to be troubled in this whole.
Yeah, but I'd like to hear more of what you have to say.
Yes.
He shot down three main themes, and I'm not about to suggest a fourth one. But how important do you think is the Pulse character, this very German that the Germans have, that sets them apart? If you travel in Europe, you know when you meet a German.
Well, what you've said troubles me in a number of respects. And I think a question period should trouble everyone. The Nazis believed that they could see a German everywhere in Europe. The Nazis believed this. Is this true? Was this true? People who are students of German culture today are struck by the remarkable cultural difference between East and West Germany, between Germans who grew up under the communist regime had their education, their socialization, their institutions, and those who grew up in the West. Those who grew up in the West are Westerners, they're materialists, they watch television. Those who grew up in the East have another kind of formation and upbringing. Is this observation that you are making an accurate one? It is recently proposed by an Israeli historian, Paul Lawrence Rose, in a book called Revolutionary Anti-Semitism. And he believes he can discern a German, quote, mentality, unquote. He thinks he has pinned it down to language. Difficult to say because the Swiss speak the same language. The Dutch speak a similar language. The formation is the same. The grammar is the same. I am not so sure. In any event, I find myself with historians of the Third Reich impressed with variation, for you do find variation. Catholic, Protestant, North, South, working class, lower class. These variations are very considerable. Just to conclude, Browning's observation in the end of ordinary men is that the men in the battalion 101 do not seem to display any German characteristics. They display disturbingly ordinary characteristics. Now,
none of these variations, none of the West Germans, the East Germans, none of them is going to step on a lawn on the grass when there is a little sign that says "stay off the grass." And I think that is that sets them apart.
Have you ever walked on a French lawn? My sense is that when it comes to these social rigidities, now it depends on social milieu. When it comes to social rigidities, I don't know. I'm not so sure at all about this lawn stepping business. What about a Japanese lawn? Yes, sir.
You spoke of a certain kind of discomfort as each of these grand designs have passed from having a large audience, and you attributed that to perhaps kind of discomfort that we didn't have a single explanatory mechanism for this. And I'd like your reaction to another thing, and that is that perhaps we're also discomforted by it because as long as we have these grand designs, that we are able to distance ourselves from any kind of direct involvement or responsibility. That as long as we can localize anti-Semitism as being specifically German, or totalitarianism as being an Eastern European and German phenomenon, and modernization, well, particularly for intellectuals in North America, we've modernized, but something on that scale didn't happen here, so it can happen here. That in each of these grand designs, not only do we have a single explanatory mechanism, but a very convenient kind of intellectual way of distancing ourselves from any kind of personal responsibility or facing up to again, these kinds of incidental, basic fundamental questions.
First of all, when I say discomfort, I'm not certain. I'm actually discomforted, and I find audiences are often discomforted. I think survivors are often discomforted. Let me follow you then to say, yes, I think what you say makes a lot of sense. I mean, if I could put it otherwise, it's in a way, it requires us to look into the void, doesn't it? I mean, it's to say that we can't adequately explain this, and because we can't adequately explain this, we can't say that we might not have been a part of such an apparatus of persecution. I mean, it is one thing to say that there were at one time in history extraordinarily evil people abroad, and they've been beaten back, and they might return, and therefore we're unsettled. But there's no problem. As far as our self-definition is concerned, we know where we stand. We're okay. But I think what you're saying is that maybe the problem lies with us. Yes.
Perhaps you covered this and I missed it, but Browning's book, Ordinary People, title, there's a lot implied there. You brought us to one city, one group of people, and how they obviously went berserk in a particular environment. But I didn't hear you tell us what he actually found that was ordinary about them in asking them why they did these things, how they behaved this way.
I guess it's a good question, and I guess it's more by way of the absence of other factors. Did they have a charismatic SS-type Gruppenführer who was leading them? See, this would be one explanation. No, they didn't. They actually had a rather nice middle-aged man who actually wanted to let them off. Were they? Did they get intense indoctrination? They actually didn't. And to the extent that they did, they didn't put much effort. They didn't pay much attention to it. So, I mean, one explanation after another seems to fall by the wayside. They show significant evidence of trying to stay out of trouble. They weren't looking for ideological confrontation. You see, it is to an absence of those elements that we conventionally associate with the Nazi stereotype.
And he stripped all of these away and there was nothing left?
Yes, now, I hasten to say, no, I didn't say there's nothing left. Small group loyalty is there, which, by the way, historians of the military find motivates people very, very importantly. That is, if I won't do it, then I'll let the group down. And I will be seen as not doing my share. You know, mundane, banal forces seem to have figured very importantly in all of this. Yes.
We say very frequently and easily that we want to teach about the Holocaust to the upcoming generations so that it will not happen again. Could you speak a bit about, could the Holocaust have been prevented had the Western nations perhaps shown more interest in
Of course it could have been prevented. Of course it could have been prevented. And of course there could have been more done. And of course rescuers could have rescued more. But this is always the case in history. You know, I have difficulty with this question because I teach history at the university and I write and I'm preoccupied with this as a historical issue. But I am not a high school teacher. I know that the rules of the game that I set for my own discourse on the subject are not the rules that apply elsewhere. I don't teach civics. Indeed, civics is one of the things that explicitly we set out not to do in my line of work. But I recognize that other people do teach civics, and well, they should. So, I mean, I'm constantly wrestling with trying to get it right. Now, how this material is used, my goodness, I don't know how the history of anything is used. Sometimes I'm quite unsettled. I think the best thing, I mean, to be practical, I think the best thing that one can do in teaching this material is to be as honest as one can be with the material and with oneself. And endlessly to pose questions. Because I think at the end of the day, you don't come away from history with any lessons that you can, carry away with you in a satchel or like a pill, but people come away with a sensibility, with a deepened sense of human potential, or the human reality, or the human condition. A sense of its diversity, a sense of its variety, a sense of its potential. To me, these are far more important than the quote lessons which pass like the seasons. Imagine the lessons that were taught about the Civil War, let's say, just a generation ago. Are they lessons now? I don't know. But deepening one's sensibility about the way people have interacted in the past, trying to get into the consciousness of a diverse array of people, including perpetrators, I think this is worthwhile. I think this is perhaps the best possible of historical subjects because it constantly requires one to ask the hard question. Yes?
Well, my question concerns the same theme of what we teach the next generation. We've been getting a rash of these revisionist so-called historians ads, advertising programs. Some university newspapers have refused to run them. Courageously, some have not. I'd like to hear what you feel of the topic of that revisionist history and also on how to address it.
The first thing is that this is, I think, the term is universally used. I might even use it myself, but it's a misnomer. This is not revisionism. Revisionism is a respected, hallowed, necessary historical practice. Indeed, we're all revisionists if we're thinking. I mean, we should be revising. Otherwise, history doesn't advance. So, this is not revision. This is fraud. I mean, this is flat Earth society. Now, perhaps a better terminology. In Canada, we refer to Holocaust denial. Call it what you will, but revisionist it is not. Now, that said, I think there is a proper place in the historical discourse for the widest array of opinions, honestly held, grounded in evidence. This stuff is not. I mean, this is anti-Jewish polemic. Now, I am just not a good tactician in dealing with such issues. There are people who are really quite good at it. And if astronomers spent a lot of their time dealing with flat Earth people, they wouldn't get astronomy done. And I do see it in that vein, although I realize that it is far more socially damaging than flat Earth stuff. But I can't provide, I'm afraid, anything more helpful than that. Yes?
A bit off the subject, but you struck a point with me that is very personal. You mentioned that the Jewish community for about 20 years was silent about the Holocaust. I'm a Vietnam vet personally, and I think as a group, combat veterans were silent for about 20 years. Historically, is this human nature? To something that's so traumatic, so out of the ordinary of civilized life, to suppress, hold down, then speak up? Is that human nature? Is that historically?
I know I'm very sensitive to what you are saying, and I think that I have to say, quite honestly, I'm not an authority in this, and I don't know, but I observe around me, as you do, this phenomenon. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. There is a kind of traumatization, if you want to call it that, but we see it not just with the two groups that we've now mentioned, but we see it with Native people, haven't we? I mean, how long has it taken before Native people have developed a historical consciousness that is in the center of the national agenda? Black history, for that matter. There is something about the history and the experience of victimization that involves, it seems to me, a sense of shame, a sense of turning inward of the anger and rage, so that it rages within, and then it comes out. Now, I'm aware of this on a number of levels. It happens that my office at the University of Toronto is next to a colleague of mine who has the chair of Ukrainian studies. And for the Ukrainian community, the famine of the early and mid-1930s has the kind of historical significance for that community that the Holocaust has for Jews, or that slavery has for blacks, or the decimation of Native people for their communities, and so on, or the genocide of the Armenians. These kinds of massive experiences of victimization that define the consciousness of people to this day. And in speaking with my colleague, he relayed to me his discomfort with the way that the history of the Ukrainian famine was being interpreted by the Ukrainian community themselves. Because they too were looking for the single key. They too were trying to see Stalin's, making a decision alone in his office one night as being at the root of the Ukrainian famine. In other words, neglecting the diversity, neglecting the range of circumstances, and neglecting the complexities I've been talking about here. I believe that there is a kind of process of maturation of the historical consciousness, but it takes time, and it takes a lot of patience, but I think academics have an obligation constantly to oblige various people, whoever they are, to play by the rules of the academy, which work, I think, not perfectly, but are the best tools we know to get it right. And I think getting it right is our first obligation. So those are some thoughts. Yes?
Yes, you began with I thought, particularly good observation about how entering the Holocaust into history is thought by so many to dilute the moral importance, the moral power of the lesson. And I'm indebted and grateful to your presentation for doing what I, as one who has a personal and professional agenda, both in morality and in history, for saying that unless it is in history, I think it dilutes the moral power of that. And particularly because, as I have always seen this portrayed mostly in literature, it comes across as the demonization of the German, rather than as the appreciation of the evil that is potential and present here, which leads to the very disturbing and yet deeply enlightening point that you have made in this presentation, that our own consciousness of our own world and our own need to be acutely morally involved in looking realistically at it is in fact the point of getting it right.
I agree very much with you. I only add, though, that the best writers, I think, do get it right. The best writers, the very best. Primo Levi, for my money, is the best. The personal preference, and he gets it beautifully. I mean, the late Primo Levi, in his book, especially The Drowned and the Saved, I recommend for addressing this point and ruminating on it as one who suffered himself in Auschwitz. Wrestling with these problems, perhaps being defeated by them in the end, at the end of his life, but in some of the most moving passages that probably ever been written on the subject. Again, it's my way of
I deeply appreciate that comment, because again, in terms of what kind of stories we prefer, the kind of stories that do not present the Manichaean division between the evil and the good, but in fact introduce us to the ambiguity, is where the moral force lies. But that's not an American preference.
Yes, well, are we copying? Yes.
On a slightly different note, in studying the causes and effects of the persecution of the Jews by the Nazis, do you ever remember thinking about similarities in the areas of motives, operations, and processes to the events that happened in our own country involving discrimination in the Ku Klux Klan?
This sounds like an essay topic. I think I'm going to have to leave you to write your essay. Because really, I just wouldn't, I have enough problem getting the Holocaust right without venturing into the history of the KKK in this country. So my apologies, I'll have to leave you to this. Yeah.
There seems to be a search for a fourth global point in your discussion, and you led us up to Christopher Browning and his characterization of trivial pursuits, or what he called, I'm sorry, I'm losing the title that he gave us, that is Browning's book.
Ordinary Men?
Ordinary Men, yeah. What I'm interested in is there seems to be a search for a fourth ism that is in your discussion. And I'm just wondering, I did some research in Lithuania last year as a guest and part of the Lithuanian government when I was over there. And I found that in my reading of ghetto diaries from Kovno and Vilna, repeatedly, that the Lithuanians, in a large sense, were just as involved, in fact, more involved in the killing, indiscriminate killing of Jews as were the Germans. And what I thought I've gained from reading a number of texts strictly on Lithuania is that a lot of the trench activities tie in some points that you made, and I'm looking for a description of this kind of psychosis that came across Lithuania, the account of the killing of 75% of its Jews in 1941 alone. A lot of it done by small people looking for power. And I'm wondering, is that the discourse that Browning is generating among historians? I'm not a historian, I'm just raising that question.
First of all, there's a danger in generalizing from any one of these research agendas, since, and I really want to correct if I've left the impression that I would like Browning's research findings about Battalion 101 to carry the burden of a general explanation. They don't. Sure. Since there were fanatics, there were SS zealots, there were true believers, and this Battalion 101 is not part of them. It shows that you don't have to be of that mindset and of that formation, of that background, to be part of this machinery. But this isn't to say that the machinery can run without such people. Now, when you look at collaborationist regimes and peoples, I have part of a chapter in my book, The Holocaust in History, looking at these. You find, once again, it's like a kaleidoscope. The picture changes, the terms change somewhat each time you look at a different people. And the change depends on all kinds of things. It depends upon the local culture. It depends upon the timing. It depends upon the previous regime. It depends upon Jewish, non-Jewish relations before the war. It depends on how the Jews are perceived, and so on. So, I mean, I cannot speak with any learning and authority on Lithuania. Interestingly, my Israeli friend Ezra Mendelsohn, who's written about the book on Jews in East Central Europe between the wars, actually finds a rather favorable relationship between Lithuania and its Jews. And that must be factored into your explanation as well. So, I mean, are we dealing, in other words, with a kind of underclass, a Lithuanian underclass, an activist underclass that has its moment to act in 1941 and 1942? I'm not sure, and I'm not well placed to answer this. But I frankly despair, at least in the state of historical culture in which we find ourselves now, of any other grand generalization superseding the lot. I think we're in an era of, the French call histoire événementielle, discrete research packages that shed a different light and enrich our perception of the whole. But I don't think our historical culture these days sustains any longer these great pictures.